Hello and welcome everyone to a book talk with a Q&A by Eric Dean Wilson, author of After Cooling. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Sustainability Council for their support of this event, especially Karen Pearson, the chairperson of the council, Joe Massa, a co-coordinator of Sustainability Awareness Week, and Lady Zapata, who keeps the lights on, so to speak. Most of all, thanks to Dr. Dan Bankendorf, my colleague who is a psychology professor. And when I proposed Eric as a speaker for this series, he mentioned he had just purchased the book and gave his unqualified yes vote to scheduling this event. And he also has given me some questions that Eric will be addressing later. We have some wonderful students joining us. You can't see them now, but you'll see them later, and they'll introduce themselves when they ask questions during the Q&A. I will also be letting the video run for a few minutes after we adjourn so that the live chat, when this is first premiered, can continue when the event is aired on October 6th, 2021. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce Eric Dean Wilson. He's a graduate of the New School's Creative Writing MFA program and is pursuing his PhD in the English program at the Graduate Center of CUNY, where his work focuses on American studies, environmental humanities, and the Black radical tradition. He currently teaches writing at Queens College, and last year he taught creative nonfiction at FIT, including to a couple of the students that are joining us today. Just a brief overview of the book After Cooling. This dazzlingly original work of literary nonfiction interweaves the science and history of the powerful refrigerant and dangerous greenhouse gas, Freon, with a haunting meditation on how to live meaningfully and morally in a rapidly heating world. In After Cooling, Eric Dean Wilson braids together air conditioning history, climate science, road trips, and philosophy to tell the story of the birth, life, and afterlife of Freon, the refrigerant that ripped a hole larger than the continental United States in the ozone layer. As he traces the refrigerant's lifespan from its invention in the 1920s, when it was hailed as a miracle of scientific progress, to efforts in the 1980s to ban the chemical and the resulting political backlash, Wilson finds himself on a journey through the American heartland, trailing a man who buys up old tanks of Freon stockpiled in attics and basements to destroy what remains of the chemical before it can do further harm. Wilson is at heart an essayist, looking far and wide to tease out what particular forces in American culture, in capitalism, in systemic racism, in our values, combined to lead us into the Freon crisis and then out. It's a story that offers a rare glimpse of environmental hope, suggesting that maybe the vast and terrifying problem of global warming is not beyond our grasp to face. Eric will be reading an excerpt from the book, and then we will follow with a Q&A and discussion. Please join me in welcoming from your homes, Eric Dean Wilson.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you, Chan, Margarita, and Rachel for being here. It means a lot to me. I really appreciate it. And I'm very excited to be here and read from this book and talk about some of the things in it. I am going to read a very brief excerpt, kind of in smack in the middle of the book. It sort of, as Amy read, it sort of toggles between two modes, following a man named Sam, who is finding Freon that still exists in the United States, despite it being banned. I went on a little road trip and met some of his clients and describing that experience. And then the bulk of the book is in three parts. And it's a history of air conditioning, really, but it's a history of air conditioning through the refrigerant that makes air conditioning happen. Best known as Freon, which is a brand name, CFCs. So there's three parts: before Freon, the age of Freon, and after Freon. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the beginning of the age of Freon. The section that Amy mentioned was when Freon was hailed as a miracle refrigerant. Um, and there's a quote that starts this from Karl Marx, Capital. Should that pain trouble us, since it increases our pleasure, profit? The 1930 meeting of the American Chemical Society was hotly anticipated, even by the laity. The country's leading chemists had gathered in Atlanta's Biltmore, a colonnaded hotel topped with twin radio towers, cables strung between them as if to show how deeply connected, how acutely smaller, the world was becoming. After the 27th year in which the traders at 11 Broad had spent the summer in air-conditioned comfort, October had brought the crash of the stock market, that devastating tumble of 1929, which, after an unrestrained decade of motoring, must have felt as if the invisible hand were meting out some unintelligible punishment. The market had spoken, and the nation was thrown into a depression as moral as it was economic. But while devotion to the cult of progress weakened for some, faith in science and technology grew even stronger. The reign of its gods, a belief in their unique blessing on the United States of America, prevailed. Chemistry would save the Union, or it would not be saved. At the start of the conference, a day oddly chilly for April in Georgia, the chemists gathered around the stage in the main auditorium for the opening act. A scientific demonstration of sorts, but something more like prestidigitation. Thomas Midgley Jr., the 40-year-old inventor of the new miracle refrigerant, faced his audience from behind a table bearing 2 glass pails and an unlit candle. To begin, Midgley lit the candle. Gently, he set the flame inside one of the pails attached to a rubber tube. Making a show of it, he bent to blow into the tube. The flame wavered, but the candle continued to burn. Next, into the empty pail, he poured a supercooled, colorless liquid. As the air of the room enveloped it, the liquid began to boil, its spectacularly low condensing point an important part of its marvel. A white vapor, visible briefly, rose to frost the rim of the glass. Midgley, a flamboyant ham, if nothing else, stuck his round face, made rounder by a pair of glasses with circular lenses, into the vapor and inhaled for several seconds, sucking the opaque wisps of dichloro-difluoromethane into his lungs, what would look to us now like a massive bong hit. He straightened, as if balancing the dollop of duck liver mousse that was his hair, grabbed the tube connected to the other pail, and exhaled. Now invisible, the refrigerant gas filled the glass pail and doused the flame, in the words of one reporter, as if pinched. Amazed, the conference room crackled with applause. For anyone who knew anything about industrial refrigerant, as the majority of the present audience of the 1930 ACS Atlanta Conference surely did, that pinch was well worth a clap or two, if not a standing ovation. To them, Midgley's theatrics would have proved 2 things, both startling at the time. First, the new refrigerant, unlike many of the so-called natural refrigerants before it, ammonia, methyl chloride, methyl bromide, butane, was non-flammable. In fact, the refrigerant smothered the flame, a characteristic that would later prompt Midgley to patent a related compound for use in fire extinguishers. And second, it was non-toxic, as proved by Midgley's big top breath. Previously, the best the industry could offer for indoor coolers had been sulfur dioxide because, though highly toxic, the refrigerant emitted a strong, musky stench that warned of a leakage, ruining the entirety of a fridge's contents in the process. Other refrigerants, the methyl group, were stealthier in their harm and so more dangerous. But now those dangers already seemed difficult to recall as CFC-12, soon to be known as Freon, solved both quandaries at once. The next day, one newspaper underscored its safety: is neither poisonous nor explodes. When it arrived on the market in 1930, Freon was touted as totally safe, an innocuousness that was, given all available evidence, true, by a company that claimed to offer better living through chemistry. In fact, DuPont unfurled that slogan shortly after the success of Freon, and so the refrigerant came to symbolize all that modern science could offer the world: efficiency, consistency, technological progress, personal comfort, and above all, safety through control. It was the chemical of no external consequences. It was an avatar of modernism, much the same way the steam engine had propelled not only ships and machines, but the ideology that had driven the Industrial Revolution. The United States was getting somewhere, and Freon was the industrial proof, but its cost remained a question whose answer was uncertain and largely unasked. For Americans, the appearance of Freon as if from nowhere meant not only a safe refrigerant, but a safe world as well. Yet it would be an absurd misnomer to label safe or non-toxic a chemical that nearly ushered in the destruction of all life on the planet. As is true with so many environmental crises, the questions are those of scale. For whom was it safe? And for how long? The answer for the default American scale, that of the individual over one generation, a rather precarious scale on which to make decisions ever since the Fordist era, when industry gained the ability to multiply a single chemical at an unprecedented rate, looks very different from the scale of the collective health of a planetary community over several generations. The refrigerant, when inhaled, caused what Midgley called a sort of intoxication. Indeed, it did, even when not inhaled. Few chemicals not overseen by the Drug Enforcement Administration have caused such an addictive craze and transformation of the psyche, fueling, as they did, the world-altering project of air conditioning and refrigeration. The April 1930 Conference of Chemists was a resounding success. Images of a future made more efficient by science, a future faster in pace and undoubtedly safer, comforted a people still grappling with the uncertainty of the global economy. They would make it out of this mess, the chemists seemed to promise, by the use of their wits and the skills of their craft. Midgley was written up in all the major papers. Icy breath puts out candle like a wet blanket. And though the weather was chilly that Wednesday, the Atlanta heat would slowly creep in by the end of the week. So I hope that gives you a little flavor of the sort of historical narrative of this book. And um, I'm really pleased to be speaking during Sustainability Week because I think that a lot of this book, that word is really interesting, sustainability. And I always think that if Raymond Williams were alive today, that would be one of his keywords in the book, keywords. Because one of the things the book explores is kind of what ideas we want to continue to sustain. If we're talking about sustainability, what is the world that we're choosing to sustain? And I think that's a really, really crucial question to ask as we think about what sustainability means.
Thanks so much, Eric. All of the claps for that beautiful excerpt. I'd like to start with some questions that Dan Bankendorf gave me because they're about the content, basically. And then I think it would be fun, especially since we have some writing students here, to talk about the craft of it and the process of it, which I think will always find a corollary in any kind of creative process that a lot of our students and colleagues here are doing. Dan's question, he starts out by wondering, in the postlude, you ask, how can we design a world that learns from this, a world in which it's desirable to avoid dumping toxins into our communities, not because this avoidance makes us virtuous people, but because we understand that the poisoning of others in our communities is a form of suicide. I think this directly relates to what you were talking about, this idea of not dangerous to whom, right? Do you think there is a fundamental misalignment between human nature and what is needed at this moment to confront the climate crisis? Can we design our way out of this?
Such a great question. So many things there. So I think it connects to part of the excerpt that I read, which is that when we think of part of our challenge is to think beyond the scale of the individual. That question about is there a tension between human nature and sort of sustainable design? Um, my feeling is a very clear and resounding no. That I don't think that, and this is part of the problem, I don't think it is human nature, whatever that is, to focus on the individual, to focus on um, a very limited trajectory of comfort or sustainability. I think it's so naturalized in our current society, which is to say, a society that was born in out of Euro America, um, and took several hundred years to become naturalized, and in which we're very much living right now. Um, it's so naturalized that it feels natural. I don't think it is. And I think that there are lots of communities, especially indigenous communities, communities in living in communities in South America, communities in East Asia that don't have that same sense of the self as an um, individualized self. So I think part of our problem is to think about designing, not just for individual consumers, but for some sense of a collective. Easier said than done, because when we talk about community, um, what does that mean, right? That means we're suddenly bumped up against people who disagree with us, who might hate us, who um, we have different needs, right? So any kind of one size fits all solution is going to be problematic. But I think that's a struggle of democracy. I mean, true democracy, right, is including trying to think about a vision of a world in which uh, our well-being is connected to the well-being of others. And this is going to the other part of the question that you were asking about. I don't think we need to be heroes. Like, we don't have to be totally selfless. I think this is something that mainstream environmentalism gets wrong all too easily. That the environmental activists are amazing and doing some amazing work, but there's often this rhetoric of like um, that you have to somehow like put aside your own wants and needs in order to like sacrifice for the greater good. There's an assumption there, and it's an assumption that I don't think is necessarily true, which is that the individual will is at the expense of the greater good, and vice versa. Um, I think that our challenge, maybe cultural challenge, but also there's all kinds of material challenges and economic challenges, is to understand that if we're going to talk about our own individual survival, we have to understand that that is connected to other people's survival. We are here because other people have allowed and helped us to be here. And we're often not, we're immersed, we're drowning in a society that tells us otherwise. We are all our own sort of self brands. But we have to understand that those are actually ourselves are connected in a very real way to somebody else. So I don't think that it demands a kind of holier than thou attitude or a selflessness. I think it just is actually quite selfish to understand that if you want to keep living, if you want your progeny to keep living, then you have to focus on the most vulnerable people. It's honestly just logic. And I think in that sense, we've got sort of our logic twisted around, and everything from our culture and our economy and everything tells us otherwise. And that's why it's no wonder that we are not thinking that. Um, so that's sort of maybe how I would address that question.
Thanks so much. And this is connected to that notion of the individual versus the collective good. Dan was saying that when he was reading your book, he thought a lot about the tension between short and long-term goals and how we often prioritize short-term desires. I mean, you're talking about that specifically with air conditioning and with cooling, with the need for cooling. Um, Dan is wondering, do you have any ideas for how we can make our short-term goals more climate friendly?
Yeah, I mean,
Tricky, right?
it's very tricky. It's such a hard question. I mean, in terms of air conditioning in particular, there's some pretty there's some pretty easy things. I mean, they're not easy, but there's some pretty simple things, I should say. Simple things are not always easy, right? Um, we have to revolutionize our energy grid. I mean, that's just Greta Thunberg's been telling us forever. I don't know if you've seen, but the leaders came forward and gave their kind of non-committal uh, goals for the COP26 conference coming up, and Greta's response was blah blah blah, which is a perfect response because she's calling out this sort of non-action, like these aren't actual commitments. Again, I think that by revolutionizing the energy grid to sustainable energy off of fossil fuels, this can be a win-win situation. You don't have to sacrifice jobs. You don't have to sacrifice. Um, you can actually increase accessibility, increase things like public transportation, high-speed rail system, all this kinds of stuff that some people in this country are so afraid of. Um, it should be a win-win situation. I think that so some of that is a sort of maybe even naive hope in design that I have. These things take time, of course. You can't just do that overnight. But I think that we should learn by now that this idea of a methane or fracked gas as a bridge fuel is just a myth because once we move to a different kind of fuel, we get real locked into that, and it's very easy to get locked to that. And there's examples of other civilizations, other countries that are leapfrogging from coal straight to things like geothermal or wind power. So all to say that the technology is there. We just have to do it. And the reason why we're not doing it is because a lot of the oil and gas industry is funding a lot of these politicians' decisions. There's a lot of money at stake for them. Um, in terms of air conditioning in particular, that's important because air conditioning takes a lot of energy. So if you switch out the refrigerants to something more climate friendly, like we're doing right now, the Biden administration last week just ended the replacements for Freon called HFCs, which were super global warming gases. And it had been kind of low hanging fruit for a long time. The Nobel Prize winning scientist who co-authored the paper that discovered that Freon was destroying the ozone layer. Just before he died, he wrote an op-ed and said, if we ban these replacements, HFCs, it would prevent as much as zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius of global warming over the next 50 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is huge. That's a lot. And the industry was into it. Politicians were into it. It had a bipartisan approval. And for whatever reason, Trump never sent it to, Trump never made that decision, even though the whole industry was behind it. So Biden took the kind of obvious first step in climate policy and took that low-hanging fruit and has now banned it. But and that's good. But we also have to change the energy that is powering that refrigerant. Um, that's a huge thing. In terms of neighborhoods, um, there's really low-tech solutions, um, ways that we can reimagine our cities. One of the best ones is planting more trees. This is more of a long-term solution. Trees take time to grow, of course. But this is probably the most sustainable solution. There are these fantastic and horrifying maps of New York City that show the average level of heat in certain neighborhoods, and it maps directly onto the amount of green space in those neighborhoods. The less green space the neighborhood has, the hotter it gets, because there's more asphalt that rejects the heat, and those also correspond to areas that are often socioeconomically depressed, and or areas with larger percentages of Black and Brown working citizens. This is not a coincidental. It's because the city has not invested in the infrastructure, and trees are infrastructure in a city, in those communities, because they do not make the city as a whole as much money. Um, Planting trees. Other one would be designing our buildings so that they don't ignore the climate. The predominant architectural assumption, because of air conditioning, in the 20th century, was that the environment, climate, was just this kind of annoying thing that you could fix with technology, right? It was just there, and you didn't really have to pay attention to it. The best designers knew that that was not true, but a lot of our housing got thrown up, and it doesn't have any. You can't make a cross breeze. They're essentially like ovens, so you have to have air conditioning in them. We can design our buildings in a way that doesn't break the bank, where you don't need that much air conditioning, or none at all. Especially in a city like New York City, that's not a desert. It does get hot here, and there are heat waves, but the number of times that you should actually need an air conditioner is very few. So those are all kind of solutions for urban design. Maybe this is my new school influence, but I do have I do have a kind of optimistic hope in our designers, because it's a way that we can kind of make these ideas material.
I think that's a good segue into talking about you as a researcher and a writer and where you got started on this and where your interest in it and your passion for researching it. And I mean, maybe a little bit about how long it took. And there's a lot of questions that come up around what resulted in this, piece that I have right here. So however you'd like to approach that would be great, but maybe starting by how did you get involved in this subject, and then maybe a little bit about what you learned and how you learned it.
Absolutely. Um, if you had told me 8 years ago that I would write a book about air conditioning, I would have thought you were crazy. I didn't know before I began this project, I didn't know anything about hardly anything in this book. Um, it began with a relationship, which I sometimes tell my students that some of the best writing can grow out of relationships, out of friendships, and uh, also friendships with other writers and artists and conversations. Um, I had known Sam. We went to college together for a long time. Actually, he was a drummer for a musical that I was acting in way, long time ago. Which is how we first met, and we became very good friends. And after college, I knew that Sam did something with a startup, and like a green energy startup. I didn't really know what that meant. Um, and one day I was going to Chicago to visit Sam, and we just started talking, and I started asking him about his job. And later on, his partner is also a friend of mine, showed up, and she said, "Oh yeah, you should ask Sam about his job because it's just really weird, and I feel like you'd appreciate it." And so here was this guy. It turns out his job was to find used tanks of an outdated refrigerant on the internet, and then drive sometimes hundreds of miles by himself, go meet these random people, often in very rural situations, um, and haggle for a price, take this tank, take it to a factory afterwards, where they can destroy it through this very ecologically responsible process. They they pass it through an arc plasma torch, um, and it turns it basically into salt water. And I was interested in this process, and he was making money from it through California's cap and trade system, which sounded like a good idea to me at the time. And maybe I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second, but my ideas about that really changed. Um, and what was really interesting to me is that he was talking to these people. He was almost like incognito. He was a little bit undercover. He is, I would consider him an activist. He's like a leftist eco nerd. He's Jewish. He came from a really socially conscious family, and wanted to get into this work to join business and sustainability. And he was meeting these people who were often global warming deniers. They were often very conservative. If they found out what he was doing with the Freon, which is to say destroying it for carbon credits, sometimes they would refuse to sell it to him. And in talking with him, I realized that rather than just like demonizing these people or speaking down to them or saying like, can you believe that? They're so stupid or something like that. He never treated those people like that. He understood where they were coming from, um, even when he didn't disagree. And sometimes most of the time, he tried to have a conversation with them. And sometimes he was able to really shift their worldview. So, in a time in which we're told that, Americans have never been more divided, blah, 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 we've heard this over and over again. It's become sort of truism. Here was this person who was speaking with people who had radically different ideas about what's important in the world, really, at the very basic basis of it, and was able to connect with them through business and, in some cases, establish a friendship and change their mind about the environment. So I thought this was very uh, inspiring to me, and I wanted to see it for myself. So we went on a road trip together, and it was just as weird as his partner suggested it was. And something that occurred to me, um, so this was about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. It grew out of that relationship, a conversation with Sam, and I thought I would write a profile of Sam, like a magazine article. Like, here's this guy who's kind of saving the world. And the more I started to talk with Sam, the more I realized how problematic my framing of that story was. This wasn't actually about Sam, and actually, the work that he was doing, the cap and trade, was at best treading water, and maybe at worst making things worse. So my expectation that this was actually a climate solution changed very slowly. Actually, it took me a long time to realize this. I realized, oh, this is actually part of the problem. When you monetize pollution like that, then it creates a market for pollution, which is to say, a desire for pollution that you can then profit off of. And there are all kinds of loopholes, and it doesn't actually solve the problem of lowering things. Now, California Cap and Trade has done a lot of great work in chemicals that are finite, like CFCs, like Freon. It's done some great work in actually lowering the amount of Freon that's in the world. But for something like carbon or methane, it's just kind of treading in place before other solutions get there, in my opinion. So my idea about that shifted. The other thing that really surprised me and shifted in my research, as I, thought I was going to write a profile, then I realized, oh, I think this is much bigger. What's the history of air conditioning? I'm a big nerd, so I got like really into that. And as it turned out, the history of air conditioning I thought was fascinating, because it was also the history of comfort. It was a history of a certain kind of comfort in the United States, and the normalization of that comfort. The other thing, which should not have surprised me, but sort of did at the time, um, was when I met Sam's clients. I had two or three moments. I only met at five of them that day, and like the greater majority of them said something that was either explicitly racist or alluded to something that was sort of racist. Um, so I talked to Sam a lot about this, and he said, "Yeah, I experienced that a lot." So I asked him, "How do you handle that? Do you call it out? What's going on there?" And at the same time, I was realizing that the history of systemic racism was wrapped up in the history of air conditioning. from the very first moment that it became a possibility, um, tied to an experiment that Benjamin Franklin was having in the late 18th century. He wrote a letter talking about how excited he was that he could mechanically cool something. And in that same letter, he described the process. And he said, you could probably use this to cool somebody. And then the last few paragraphs described how, oh, but you don't need to uh, this would only be something that white people could use because the enslaved Africans don't need air conditioning because they're from Africa and they can endure in the heat, which was a common idea at the time. So at the very moment that it becomes a possibility in the United States, it also becomes denied to the enslaved people. And of course, that's a myth. There's the difference in the cooling system in our bodies. And this is a pattern that happens again, 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 in a different way, that that cooling or that assumption about comfort is denied to less dominant groups, especially Black Americans. And so I really tried to pull that out because I thought, wow, this is a history of air conditioning, but it's actually also a history of denying comfort to certain groups of people in order so that other groups of people can be comfortable.
That is an incredible journey that you went on. And Dan asked another question. He mentioned Sam, who appears quite a bit in the book. He's a strong character, and Dan describes him as a hero. Although you're problematizing that, as we say, um, that brings up the question: what can we do as individuals and as a society to encourage more people to do the kind of work that will help towards a solution? And how can we support people who are already doing that?
Another great question and another hard question. um, I do think of Sam as a hero. I'll say that. And he's a close friend. But I think he's heroic in the way that he's willing to meet people where they are and also not compromise his values, which is that's a hard tension to balance. And um, it's hard. I mean, I think that I'll always kind of land on the idea of the individual as a kind of problem. Somehow we have to think about connecting about the importance of connecting ourselves to organizations that are working on this, and to understand that it's not just people who are explicitly working on this that it affects. Um, this is really this is shaping our all of our future, even as it's shaping all of our futures in very different ways and impacting us in very uneven ways. Some people are more impacted than others. Um, and yet, it is something that really ties us together. So I think understanding that somehow, that it's not some kind of niche topic, it actually is something that has everything to do with all the other activist projects. It has everything to do with patriarchy. It has everything to do with systemic racism. It has everything to do with the economic situation. It's kind of this like meta problem that all of these other problems are swirling around in. It's not an additional one. So I always think that, plugging in when we have time, we're humans, we're all working and trying to, um, to eat. Those of us who don't come from money. And so we only have so much energy and free time to give. But, I always say when you can connect to a group that feels like you're meeting people that feel like family, this work can be fun. I've been part of some activist organizations that the people became close and dear friends to me. And I think that being connected to a kind of um, greater organizing moment that's already happening, and there are many in the city and across the country, um, is crucial. The other thing is really pressing our government leaders. Um, in ways that we can. I mean, the best way to do that is with an activist group. And also having conversations with people about it. Again, I'm maybe a little optimistic or naive about that too, but I think that, especially those who come from families or communities where that might not, where ecology or environmental issues might not be on the forefront. I think it's our job, those of us who care about this, to bring that stuff up, and sometimes in an uncomfortable or relentless way, and in a way that I think is not apocalyptic, but again is making people understand that this is not something that we can just uh, pretend that is not happening. It's going to shape. It is shaping already our whole lives. Um, so that's what I would say.
Thank you. I think we could spend a whole other hour if we had it on the role of social media and other venues and ways that people are exchanging their opinions versus information. And there's a lot of things. And I think we could connect it to the pandemic. We can connect it to a lot of issues that are related. At this point, I would love to invite our guests, our special guests, who are all students, to turn on their cameras and to ask a question or more than one question of Eric. And I just want to say that I want to thank them all for being here, Margarita, Rachel, and Chan. And they're very busy, like all FIT students are, and they made some time today. Two of the three have been Eric's students, and two of the three have been my students. And how does that work out? Well, there's one who was in both of our classes at various times. So please, I'm waiting for them. Turn on your cameras. Hello. Yay. Hi. Awesome. And then just unmute yourself when you have a question. And if you could just briefly say your name and your major, I think everybody would love to hear that.
Oh, sorry.
You can go, Jen.
Worst part about the online. Okay, I'll go. My name's Chan, and I'm a spatial experience designer. And yeah, I mean, listening to this was kind of like, it's crazy because like I didn't know any of it either. So like going through that whole process must have been crazy. I'm wondering like when you came to like the conclusion of it all, like do you think like people will give up that comfort, or do you think it's just we just have to come up with a replacement, I guess, for air conditioning?
Such a great question. So, and it's so great to see you, Jen. Uh, so two things. It was a while before I realized kind of what the point I'm making. I made different points at different drafts of it that just didn't quite feel right. And I started working with an editor, and he just kept telling me, just focus on telling the history, focus on telling the history. And I kept saying, like, I don't want to write a history. I'm not a historian. And he was like, well, then don't think about it as a history. Think about it as a story. This is what you're doing, is you're telling the story of air conditioning. And so, actually, I worked with a different editor, my current editor, Megan Hogan at Simon & Schuster, who was fantastic, and she really kept pushing me to stretch that story, really just try to kind of exhaust it and tell every moment of it. So, in a way, I thought of before I thought about what the kind of conclusion was, I just tried to kind of tell. It's almost like a portrait of a chemical. It was like, how do I tell the life of this chemical and how it touched people. And I was really alert to kind of patterns, especially like metaphors, because I think this is related to your second question of like, do you think people will give this up? And I have some kind of dim hope in the idea that part of, not everything, but part of our struggle is a struggle of imagination. That's what we as cultural makers can do. Another huge part of that, of course, is like design, material infrastructure, economy. That's huge. I don't think that you can really fix this problem under capitalism as we have it, which is always, I think, frustrating to people because they're like, well, what do we do about that? But again, there's that Frederick Jameson quote, is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think that that is quite telling and terrifying, is that actually what we've got to do in order to achieve these material ends is to work on our imaginations and think about what world we want and how we might get there. So to answer that second question, Chan, I think that if we frame it as sacrifice, as something that is like giving up something, I don't think people are going to do that. And I think it's a great question, because I think that what your question implies is correct, that, you know, if we just expect everyone to, like, out of the goodness of their heart, like, not use air conditioning, that's not going to happen. But I think if we try to reframe this, which is something that I've tried to do in the book, and ask, is this actually leading to a more comfortable world? Sure, you might think you're comfortable for a few minutes or something like that. But what's fascinating to me, and what was shocking to me, is that I, who grew up in the South, the very hot, humid South, in air conditioning, I loved air conditioning. During the process of the book, I was determined to see what it would be like to try to go without air conditioning in my apartment. And not everybody can do this for various reasons. But I was shocked to find that my level of comfort shifted radically. At a certain point, it didn't feel like suffering at all. It felt fine. And you can't do that everywhere. You can't do it in Phoenix, Arizona, for instance. But the question we should really ask is the same that we're asking about those who live on the shoreline with rising seas. Should people be living there? You know, and you know, a short-term solution is air conditioning, or like a seawall in that case. But a long-term solution would be thinking about how to support people in a kind of what's sometimes called managed retreat. That's a huge, huge idea. But I think we have to ask it instead of pretend that it's not a solution. So I think if we're framing that as something to give up, then it's not going to happen. But if we're framing it as something that actually, what kind of world do we want? Do we want a world in which we, you know, aren't terrified to have children because we don't want to, you know, have them live through water wars? Or, you know, do we want a kind of, do we want a world where we can fix all these problems, you know, at once? And I think recontextualizing that and trying to redefine what we mean by comfort as not just individual comfort, but a kind of collective comfort would be my response to you.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's interesting because you were talking about earlier, like how a lot of these modern day, I guess, like activists want to give up things, like, and it has to be a sacrifice for it to be progress. But I guess in terms of like the general public, that's not a mentality that the society has, I guess.
Totally. You know, and the just quickly, something that often comes up is people say, well, you know, air conditioning saves lives. And in some cases it does, but in a place like New York, the moments when we need air conditioning the most are during heat waves, which are the moments when the electric grid fails. So the moment when you need the air conditioning the most, you can't have it. Or it becomes tiered among those who can afford the energy, or can afford the air conditioning, and those who can't. So then it becomes a solution for the wealthy or the wealthier. So there's all kinds of problems to pick apart with that. And I'm hoping that even just by complicating it, then people will begin to think about it a little more critically, because part of the thing that's so disturbing to me is that air conditioning is one of those things that people just conveniently don't think about, because it's so easy.
Just to keep an eye on time, we have about 10 minutes left in the hour here. So maybe if Margarita, you had a question, and then maybe Rachel has something she'd like to ask as well. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I actually took a couple of notes because you touched on so many things that I had questions like going into this. And you mentioned about building our cities to kind of withstand like climate differences, and I feel like New York, kind of being a very left-leaning city, does do a lot of things that help with that, like including like the Cool Roofs program, which like we paint roofs white so that we do have to use less air conditioning. But still, a lot of things about New York, especially the subway system, as we learned like what was it 2-3 weeks ago, where the subway's all flooded because we are a coastal city. Like where do we really go from that? Because of course, New York is such a staple that you can't always expect it to just, shift. Um, and also, I feel almost as if the like youth feels a little bit gaslit almost into believing that we have to make sacrifices to kind of save the environment. And I correct me if I'm wrong. There's like this new rallying cry that like 71% of global emissions are by 100 companies. So what can we really do as individuals to that could shift the difference away from that? And then I have one more question, but I'll let you kind of handle that really quick.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's really why when we have an economic system that, on a cultural level teaches us not to value things like community resilience and things that can't be monetized. And, on a government level allows these companies to just um, have extract labor and resources. Um, you could gather all the CEOs who are responsible for those 71% emissions in my tiny apartment. It would be packed, but you could get them all in this room. And so you're totally right that it's we have to think about a way of focusing on that. I think the other part of that is that you have to kind of drum up enough from the groundswell so that there's enough pressure so that that changes. Both have to happen at the same time. In terms of sort of city infrastructure in New York, at least, I think I have a sort of relatively simple solution to that, which is tax the rich. I mean, getting to what you're saying in terms of like who is responsible for this, New York is loaded. It's loaded with people who have so much money and they get to send it to whatever philanthropic organizations they want and get tax breaks. Well, if they live here or they own real estate in those giant condos where they don't actually live but make money, they should pay for this. That's very simple. And I think that that also hopefully would mitigate some of that despair, rightly so, that a younger generation and I myself am feeling about like, why should we have to pick up the slack? I think the other thing I would say is maybe like the little bit of James Baldwin in my head saying that, um, these things are terribly inconvenient, that we have to fight for these things, but that is the way it is. Um, and I would rather fight for a world as to save a sense of my own dignity, even if, regardless of what happens in the end. I think fighting for it and in doing so, uh, earning a sense of dignity is actually a huge part of it. Um, and so I don't think that, again, I think that that sort of activism, especially from us younger folks and a younger generation, um, is it's kind of key to like well-being because it connects us to what it means to be human.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really great answer. And I kind of want to also, my next question connected to what you said about dignity and about also monetizing pollution earlier. Speaking as someone who's in the advertising program, advertising and digital design, a lot, myself included, a lot of my classmates and I've spoken about it, the sort of moral quandary between advertising things that we don't agree with and like where to draw the line between making a living and promoting things that we know harm the environment. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
That's such a tough one. I think we all struggle with that, and teachers struggle with that too. And it um um part of me is like wants to be so protective and be like, you shouldn't have that thought yet. You should have like 10 more years so that you don't have that thought because it will come to you. But you're right. This is what I'd say. There is no outside capitalism. You can't go, even if you go to like a commune, you're still within capitalism. It's only a waiting thing. So, which is to say that we all have to work. Actually, I know some fierce radical leftist Marxists who also work in like corporate advertising. And, I don't think that that's being a hypocrite. I think that that's just how you survive. What else are you supposed to do? The people who can do, the people who have the privilege of not working in those industries sometimes tend to come from money, or they worked in tech for 10 years or something like that. I mean, that's not always the case, but you also have to take care of yourself in order so that you can do this work and try to shift something. So I don't have a clear answer about that, but I would say that like in that sense, we're all hypocrites. And I think that maybe don't like run gleefully into the arms of the corporate overlords, but we're in a tough spot, and you got to kind of live in the way that you can so that you don't lose sight of that making the world a better place. I mean, I think if you lose sight of that, then that's a problem. But if you don't and you figure out a way to make it work, then that's all right.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you
Hi, I'm
go.
Rachel. I'm in fashion design. And actually, it's funny that Margarita brought up monetizing pollution because that was kind of what my question piggybacked off of. Because you mentioned how um, monetizing pollution, even though it had good intentions with like economically, like destroying the Freon in a good way, it's still monetizing pollution and creating a market for it. So like my question was, what are your thoughts on, I guess, creating a market for sustainability, and I guess on a more negative note, greenwashing, and companies making profit off of how everyone's now into this sort of fad of sustainability. I know it's very prevalent in fashion as well. So I guess kind of like how much of a good thing is kind of bad.
Totally. Greenwashing is terrible because it makes you think, it's like uh when BP is like saying that they're like saving the earth, it's like, really, like, you're the person who created this problem. Um and as you all know, especially in fashion, um that greenwashing is particularly pernicious because it allows consumers and also like the people regulating these companies, if there are people who regulate these companies, um, to believe that it's okay, that their processes are fine. There was a couple years ago, there was like an H&M ad that was like, we're helping make the world a greener place. Meanwhile, they're one of the worst fast fashion places. So I think what I'm getting at and what you're getting at is that even those individual companies, I think, are whatever they're doing, whether it's real or not in terms of lowering their carbon footprint, is only going to have so much effect in a system that allows us to devalue community well-being. If you are able to make money off of diminishing water supply or destroying rural communities or exploiting labor, Labor laws in this country have improved somewhat the situation of working people, but at the expense of moving those factories overseas. So the practices didn't actually stop or change. They just moved to other countries. And that is actually a product of capitalism. It's a product of the global market, of the global capitalist system, that always looks for a way to exchange capital. Capital always has to be in motion. And it also, the only thing to activate capital, the only thing to create value is actually not technology, but it's labor. And so you always look for cheaper and cheaper and cheaper labor that will give that product value. That is, we're living through a moment right now where we're realizing that that doesn't work. And that it can only lead to the exploitation of, forget the planet for a second. It's always going to exploit people. But people are part of that planet. And in that sense, it exploits them as well. So that's the problem, I think, with cap and trade, is that, like I said, with a finite material like actually Freon, it can actually do some good work. And I think it has done some good work. I'm not sure that it's done work for any other chemical other than Freon. Naomi Klein, the great Naomi Klein, who wrote This Changes Everything and a bunch of other books, she documented something that was happening in India where there were HFCs, which are the replacement chemicals that were being manufactured pretty cheaply in India, and there was a byproduct of HFCs that was made from those that were actually banned under global treaty. And there's a global cap and trade system to destroy those chemicals because they're banned and they're so bad. What happened was they started to hype up production of that byproduct in order that they could make money off of destroying it. So it became this ridiculous scheme where they were making more money destroying the bad chemical than they were creating the good chemical. So this is what can happen in that system that monetizes pollution like that. I think maybe I'm not an expert in these economic systems, but it's difficult for me to also, in the short term, to see a way forward that doesn't include heavily taxing carbon, which I think is a different issue, and also stop giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which we continue to do right now, and in the city especially. But I think that's why we really need a more systemic view, is understanding that that's not going to happen overnight, but not losing sight of that horizon. That actually what we're talking about is radically shifting our system of values. And I think the best person who's writing about this is Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose book Braiding Sweetgrass is, I think we read it in class, Chan and Rachel, one essay from it. I think she's the best at describing this, and part of that reason is because she has a worldview that's so plugged into something that's completely alternative. She has an indigenous worldview that values a totally different set of things that aren't capital. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's my squirrely answer to your very good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that unfortunately we have to wrap up a little bit in a little bit, but I have to say, Eric, maybe you agree with me that people like these folks here and Greta Thunberg and others of the Generation Z give me hope.
Without doubt, absolutely. I mean, that is the greatest hope that I had, is a young, energetic generation, and that not just that, but a young, energetic generation that's connected to other generations. So I think that's really important too, is that kind of intergenerational solidarity. I've seen better lectures about ecological philosophy in a 2-minute TikTok video than I've like ever read in a book of philosophy from like 16-year-olds. It's incredible. I think the knowledge sharing that's going on via social media, to kind of go back to, you know, what you were saying earlier, Amy, we could definitely have a whole conversation about this, is so inspiring, and it really gives me hope.
I guess I would say as educators, we probably would encourage our students to stay informed, to look below the surface, to read books like yours, and he has a vast set of notes at the end for further information and further reading. Where could people who are watching this video find out more about you, about your work, to connect with you? What's the best way to do that, Eric?
I have a website, and it's just my name, ericdeanwilson.com. And there's a list of articles that I published, and a little bio and things like that. That's what I would say. Yeah, and you can buy the book. It's in hardcover from your local independent bookstore. There's also an audiobook that I recorded in this closet this summer, which was quite an experience. No air conditioning, obviously, in a hot closet. Um, uh, so if that's your jam, then you can listen to me read the book.
So there will be links to things online, maybe podcasts and interviews, and also I'm assuming you have an events page, so that if you have some upcoming, hopefully face-to-face events that people can check out and meet with you. Thank you again so much. Thank you again, Rachel, Margarita, and Chan, and thank you, Eric. And I want to thank everyone who's watching this. And just to mention that we're for the premiere, Eric and I are in the chat answering questions for a few more minutes. And again, thanks to the Sustainability Council for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Chen. It's been a pleasure.
Be well, everyone.